Dr. Ross, you are an expert in a variety of areas. You're an astrophysicist, you're an apologist, and you're one of the best people to go to on this topic of UFOs and aliens and extraterrestrials. This is a subject that for a long time, I think, was seen as fringe or was sort of not discussed maybe in the mainstream. And suddenly here we are. It's a topic we're seeing in Congress. We're seeing testimony in Congress. We're seeing all sorts of government documentation on this and stories that previously, again, were sort of concealed coming out into the open. What do you make of sort of this newfound cultural, resurgence and interest in this topic?
Well, I became a UFO expert, but not on purpose. I was an amateur astronomer before I became a professional astronomer. So every university where I served, they said, you have to handle all the UFO reports. And about 99% of what people would report to me as UFOs, I could explain as natural phenomena, a hoax, or secret government military activity. But there's a 1% residual that falls in a different category. And these would be UFO phenomena that observers report violating the laws of physics. On the other hand, they leave evidence indicating that they're real phenomena. And that, I think, explains why you have a lot of scientists and skeptics saying this doesn't exist, because they come from a worldview that doesn't permit the existence of non-physical reality. But as a Christian, as a believer in the inerrancy of the Bible, I do believe in the existence of non-physical reality, because the Bible tells us God created two different species of intelligent life, one that's constrained by the physics of the universe and one that is not. And we're talking about humans that are indeed constrained by the dimensions and laws of physics of the universe, and angels who are not. And these angels live in a different dimensional realm, but God has given them the power to come in temporarily into our realm. So I think that's where that 1% residual falls. And some of the strongest evidence for that is that where you got multiple observers tracking a UFO going through the atmosphere, which means we can actually calculate its trajectory and velocity. And the velocities often run between 5 and 25,000 miles per hour. But the observers never record the occurrence of a sonic boom or a heat friction trail behind the UFO. If it was a physical object, you would get a sonic boom. You would get a heat friction trail, just like you do when one of the spaceships goes through our atmosphere from the International Space Station. However, there are a couple of thousand cases documented where the UFO not only goes through our atmosphere, it crashes into the Earth. And when you go to the crash site, you see a crater. If there's snow, the snow is melted. The vegetation is consistently damaged. But as you investigate that crater site, there's never any debris. There's no artifacts. If it was a physical craft crashing into the Earth, you'd be able to recover some debris and artifacts. But the fact that you see a crater and melted snow and damaged vegetation means that something real caused that. So we're dealing with non-physical reality, or what the French astrophysicist Jacques Vallée referred to. He says, we're dealing with interdimensional phenomena. I mean, he's not a believer, but that was his conclusion. We're dealing with a phenomena that's operating in dimensions different than those of the universe.
What you just described is so fascinating to me as a Christian. Let me start there. As a Christian, I think of Ephesians 6. I think of the verses that we often don't talk about, even in the church, about the spiritual battle that is going on, that there's this unseen realm where this battle is unfolding, right? And I think about what you were just describing. I also have pondered as a journalist, and I've often thought, okay, well, you have a situation where people are claiming that there are beings and there are spaceships, and they're talking about them as though they're physical, and they will describe it in a way where these beings are so intelligent, they've been, unable to be detected. They somehow crash, though. They're so intelligent, they crash, and then they mysteriously disappear right away. And it just doesn't seem to add up. If you're so intelligent and so good at escaping, how did your aircraft crash consistently, right? And so what you're describing as these spiritual elements, I think it's really, really an interesting idea to think of it that way. And I think the question people would then naturally have for you, and I'd love to get your take on this, right? What exactly would you definitively say, and it seemed like you were saying this, that this is essentially the angelic and demonic realm, really the demonic realm that maybe we're dealing with here in a spiritual sense, not a literal alien flying around in space in the physical.
Well, back in the 1960s, the U.S. government commissioned the physicist Alan Hynek to investigate the UFO phenomena. And he was the one that came up with this term close encounters of the first kind, second kind, and third kind. And what you notice in these, a close encounter of the first kind is where the human contactee is within 500 feet of the UFO phenomena. And when you're talking about the second kind, this is where they actually begin to experience some kind of physical harm. There have even been instances where people have been killed or their animals have been killed. And then there's instances where people claim to have direct communication with UFO beings. But what's interesting about these close encounters, it's never beneficial. It's always deleterious. The best you're going to come away from with one of these encounters is recurring, terrifying nightmares. Worst case scenario, you get killed. So they're harmful, but there's also evidence that there's deception involved in these encounters. Because when people claim to have had conversation with these UFO beings, they will claim, well, in fact, if you go back 100 years ago, they were saying they were from the backside of the moon. But when the public became educated enough to realize that's not credible, they changed their story and said, well, we're from Venus. People realize how hot it is on the surface of Venus. They said they were from Mars. Well, now they're claiming to be from another planetary system. So the fact that they keep changing their story. And then you've got those cases where the human contactee goes into a trance, and then they begin to type out what the UFO being wants them to communicate. And
It sounds like automatic writing, by the way. That sounds very similar to what
it's automatic writing, and it's extensive. I mean, probably the most dramatic example would be a big book, the Urantia book. It's kind of the Bible for all these UFO cults. And some editions run 4,000 pages. The entire book was communicated through automatic writing. But what's interesting about the Urantia book, about a third of its content denies the deity of Jesus Christ. So there, I think you can see the deceptive motivation behind this UFO phenomena. And in this book, Lights in the Sky and Little Green Men, we point out that we have a scientific testable model for this UFO phenomena. Because what you notice in these close encounters, it's exclusively experienced by people who have significant involvement in the occult. And when you remove that occult factor, that's the end of the UFO encounters. Increase the degree of occult, you increase the frequency of these UFO encounters. And as we document in this book, you notice there's a much higher incidence of these close encounters in nations where there's a high incidence of occult involvement. Examples would be France, Equatorial Brazil, and I got to see this firsthand when I went to the Soviet Union when the communists were in control. And what I noted back then is that the Soviet Union was sponsoring occult physics research at their major universities. And so a lot of the physicists I was engaging at that time were deeply involved in the occult. Many of them were demon-possessed, and many of them were having these close encounters with UFOs. Now, when you go back to Russia, the incidence of that has dramatically dropped because the incidence of occult involvement has dramatically dropped. So I end this book by saying, close all the doors to occult involvement in your life and the life of your close relatives. That will be the end of your UFO encounters. This is a testable model.
You know, I have to tell you, as you're describing all of this, you know, my background, one of the things I've worked on is a book on evil and looking at demons and possession and what Scripture says about it and interviewing people who have come out of the occult. And a lot of the descriptions that people will have, and of course, not everybody is going to believe all of these instances. And similarly to what you were talking about, many of them, there are natural explanations. But for those that are documented and they clearly went through something, these individuals will say that the demons they interacted with were telling them very similar lies, right? That they were deceased loved ones. I mean, that's a big thing with mediums and psychics, obviously, for those watching, that, you know, they will tell you they're communicating with the dead, right? The souls of the dead, when in reality, the demonic entities are lying about that. And so it's interesting when you're sort of going through the lies that, you know, might be being perpetuated by these beings and these encounters that people believe are aliens. That is very, very interesting to me. And the other thing I wanted to ask you, just as you were talking about these countries where there's more occult activity, you know, I'd love to get your take on this, and maybe I'm off base here, but it is interesting to watch. I know there's nothing new in these claims. You're not seeing any new details, even though there are more of these claims of alien encounters. But as America seems to be sort of pulling back from its Christian rooting, right? Pulling back, we're seeing secularism sort of rampantly grow. Do you think there's any connection between that move away from God, even nominally, that we're seeing, and this increase in alleged interactions with these, you know, purported beings?
Well, I think the evidence for that is that in states where there's a higher involvement in the occult, you see a higher incidence of these close encounters with UFOs. Good examples of that would be Alaska and Hawaii. And in those states in the Union where there's a very low incidence of occult involvement, likewise, you see a much lower incidence of people claiming to have these close encounters. But my passion is for the individual that's having these encounters. Close the doors, and that will deliver you from these horrifying experiences. And, you know, also be careful about who you are in contact with. You know, like if your father's involved, that could be, the demon can work through that. And keep in mind, these fallen angels can take whatever form they choose. They can appear as your dead grandfather. They can appear as a flying saucer. They can appear as a leprechaun. And so that's why it tells us in 1 John, test the spirits. Don't believe every supernatural being that approaches you. Put them to the test.
Wow, that is incredibly powerful, and this has all been really thought-provoking. Of course, I have to ask you about David Grush and the, you know, testimony. He's obviously an intelligence officer, served for 14 years in a variety of capacities. His testimony, congressional testimony, garnered a lot of attention. What was that like for you to watch, and what were some of your takeaways on that?
Well, he's been speaking about this for many years, and what I noticed in his testimony before Congress is that he softened his claims a lot. He used to be claiming that our government actually had bodies of UFO beings. He basically says, no, what we have is biologic tissue. And he was also hedging his claims about what they had in the way of their hangars. But he stood by his claim that our government actually has significant physical pieces of alien spacecraft dating back to 1933. And so I wound up doing a podcast on why his claims should not be believed. They're not credible. I mean, I can give you 3 quick reasons. Number one, U.S. government security is not up to the task. 6 decades of cover-up of something that fits in multiple hangars where you got 20, 30, 50-foot pieces of artifacts. I mean, you're young, but I can remember when Richard Nixon, as a U.S. president, tried to cover up a single audio cassette tape. And he was only successful in doing that with all the power of the executive branch behind him. He could only cover up a cassette tape for 11 days. So are we to believe that the government actually has these hangars filled with physical craft, with biological tissue inside of them that nobody's been able to come out? And I say, number 2, where are the artifacts? I mean, I've been to different museums where I've been able to see up close multiple rocks recovered from the Apollo astronauts. real artifacts that I can see that are on display in a museum where people pick them up and handle them with special gloves, of course. But there's nothing like that with the UFO phenomena. Nothing that you can tangibly see and touch that's in a museum. That's never come out. And the third reason is, I think, the most compelling. It's simply not possible for a physical craft to travel through interstellar space, at least not a craft of significant small size. I mean, for example, astronomers are interested in sending spaceships to the nearest planet outside of our solar system. It's only 4.2 light years away. But they realize as these spaceships travel through space, they'll encounter electrons, protons, helium nuclei, tiny pieces of dust. And this will destroy the craft, and the greater the size of the craft, the greater the destruction. So they've come up with a plan to say, we're going to send tiny spaceships, and we're going to send a whole bunch of them. So the proposal is to send 1,000 spaceships, no bigger than 10 centimeters across, to the nearest planet outside our solar system, with the understanding that at least half of them will be totally destroyed. The other half will only be partly destroyed, but destroyed in different ways. And so the hope is we'll get some information back. But there's no way you're going to send a termite across interstellar space, or even a microbe, let alone something the size of a human being. In fact, I've written articles making the point, if you want to send an animal, a physical animal, roughly the size of a human being, across interstellar space, number one, you're looking at thousands of years to make the trip. That's a long time, way beyond the lifetime of a human being. And you're going to need a spaceship at least the size of the Death Star, because you need the spaceship to be big enough that you can protect the inhabitants from deadly interstellar radiation. And you also need to be able to provide them with artificial gravity and enough sustenance that they can survive trips that are going to last thousands of years. And so at a minimum, you're going to need a spaceship that's 1,000 kilometers across. And if you really want to be safe about doing it, you're going to need something about the size of our moon. And so the idea that these things in hangars in different places, no, it's way too small to bring beings across interstellar space.